Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is still the backlog. This week we're doing Mega Man Zero 4, the last in the series. So far, Zero 1 was structured horribly, 2 was hard in a really obnoxious way, and 3, while the best, seemed a bit too easy. So, did 4 stick the landing? The basic gameplay is the same. You run around, taking out enemies, jumping about platforms, and making your way to the boss room. Game overs and button mapping work just like in 3. Several of the finer elements, though, have been tweaked. Like in 3, you can't level up your weapons, and this time you only have 3, the staple Zero Saber and Buster, and then the Z-Knuckle. The Z-Knuckle is unique in that you kinda jab your hand into an enemy, and if you finish a foe off with it, you can steal their weapon, and the button map to the knuckle will use that instead. Each have a set number of uses, and at any time, you can chuck the weapon as an attack to get rid of it. That kinda puts this game in a weird spot where it has both the least and most number of weapons in the series. While this is a neat concept though, I personally only use the knuckle when I needed to, like to pull switches, grabbing a water gun to put out fires, or stealing a keycard for a secret door. I never felt the need to play around with it and experiment, largely because the saber and the gun did what I needed it to do, and partly because the knuckle is so short-ranged that getting close enough to grab a weapon that I didn't even know what it did never really seemed worth it. Maybe if I were better at the game, I'd be more comfortable. It might have also given me the one thing my sword and gun were missing, and that was the diagonal strike zone that the triple, chain, and recoil rods gave me in previous games. There were definitely times that I missed that. The Cyber Elf system has been completely reworked. Rather than the one use and they die, or even the satellites, this time you get just one baby elf. Collect energy crystals and feed them to the elf to raise it. Each time you do will unlock an ability in 3 categories: Nurse, which supplements your health, Beast, which improves your movements, and Hacker, which typically gives your weapons more options. When you clear most stages, it raises the level cap on this sort of skill tree, and you can move the points around to try out different loadouts. I don't mind this system. It doesn't punish you for wanting to power up, and is much more straightforward than how they worked in the past. The only real issue I have is that the system seems to expect you to grind someone, which always feels like an odd requirement for these games. Another thing they seem to expect you to grind for are parts. These sometimes drop when killing enemies. When you have parts that seem to work together, you can combine them, and if you do it right, you get either a head, body, or foot part, like the ones in the last game. If you screw up though, they get turned into junk. While the game gives you a few hints, the only 2 ways I can think of for figuring out the recipes are by either trying things willy-nilly and save scumming when you fail, or, more practically, looking up an FAQ. Given the drop rate of some of this stuff though, how most require 3 or 4 parts, and how opaque these combinations are, I really have to wonder how they expected people to play this. Were they expecting long articles with tips and Nintendo power? Did they expect people to grind? To reset upon failure? Or was this just a way for bad players to compensate by letting them get better power-ups after hours of grinding? I really don't know, and I would have preferred the way they did it in the last game, the full parts being either boss drops or hidden in the stages. Instead, I was just carrying around a bunch of random crap, not naturally finding the right parts for any of the stuff I actually wanted to make throughout my playthrough, and only making a single piece of junk once when I was playing around with the system. As for the difficulty, I guess I'd say yes. You have 2 intro stages, and then get a full 8 stages and bosses to choose from, with 2 story missions in the middle, and then a set of 4 final missions. The intros are gimmies. The main 8 are various levels of tricky, but not obnoxiously hard. The middles are 1 simple and 1 that goes on for longer than you'd expect, and then the difficulty curve gets thrown out the window for the last 4. The first is all kinds of hell. It starts off slow enough, then has a long stretch of moving platforms that may or may not sync up over bottomless pits, with a ton of spike walls and ceilings thrown in, with occasional respawning enemies floating into you to knock you to your deaths. You need to be a master of jumps and aerials to clear this. Then the next stage is a gimmick and kind of a gimme, the one after that also being pretty simple. The last is the boss rush, and that's about what you'd expect, but seriously, what's with that first one? It feels like they mixed up the order here. Another thing making the game hard in an odd way are just how stingy the enemies are with drops. I already complained about how they seem to want you to grind for crystals and parts, but it goes beyond that with health refills being pretty rare. If you make a mistake, it can be hard to recover, and if you have a sub-tank, good luck finding anything to put in it. Then there's also the bosses. And sub-bosses. I really don't know what happened here, but the sub-bosses are largely simple affairs, only having a few attacks, but for some reason, they are just damage sponges. Even when using weaknesses, they just take way too many hits. It feels like someone realized that they made them too easy and decided that the best way to compensate was to just make them have so much HP that it gave the player a lot of room for error. The bosses are the same as in the previous games, some being pushovers, half being about as hard as you'd figure for the series, and then a few being just a lot harder than all the rest. While the ranks are back, they seem to be more for your satisfaction. Instead of a high rank giving you a harder boss fight and better reward, each stage has a weather effect. Choose the one that benefits the boss and they'll have an extra move. If you defeat them like that, you get their X skill. Elemental chips are missing from this game, so these skills are where you get that function. You get a neutral, electric, fire, and ice skill for both of your Saber and Buster. The Saber skills can all be equipped at once and you use a directional input to pull it off. You can only choose one for your Buster at a time though, and you use it by charging. I kinda prefer the chips, to be honest, because some of the skills you get can't actually be used on the opponent that's weak to it. The Minotaur blocks shots, including the ice one. The Moth rarely gets low enough to use the electric stab on. The Wolf gets obliterated by both Flame Slash and Shot, further adding to the unbalanced difficulty. And then there's Kraft. Kraft, Wheel's main enforcer in this game. He is awful. Dude has more moves than anyone other than maybe the final boss in the game, making him harder to predict. He fights you in open areas without walls, so you can't climb them to dodge. His one melee attack has such a large hitbox that it's still practically ranged and does a ton of damage. If he rolls into a corner and uses this one attack of his, you have no room to dodge. He has so much damn HP. The first time you fight him, you have to go right into the mission and there's no chance for you to duck out and try to improve your loadout. He is cheap and unfair, and I hate him for his character as well, which we'll talk about soon enough. The first stream of the game I did, I was having a great time until his level came up and I had to run through it again and again, only for him to use his bullshit on me and make me do it all over again. Conversely, the final boss is worth the build-up. It's a cool fight that's fun to learn, and while it seems overwhelming at first, can be gotten through with minimal damage if you pay attention. The final form is a desperate battle that is very tricky to deal with, and one of the main strategies is just trading blows, encouraging you to not only come prepared, but to master their first stage so you can go in running on all cylinders. It's probably the most memorable fight in the series, which is why it's one of the few times I won't complain about how just dickish a boss fights. Now for the story, which will contain light spoilers, with a warning later on for major ones. You start out rescuing a caravan of humans fleeing from Neo Arcadia and Wheel. They're tired of his tyranny and run to the only area of nature to return after the Elf Wars. Wheel's determined to either get them back or wipe them out as an example. He's even willing to wipe out their place of refuge, located at Area Zero, to do so. When you go to help out, you're met by Kraft and his 8 subordinates who posture for a moment and then go off to pave the way for Wheel's space station, Ragnarok, and its highly destructive laser. The villains are interesting and you get a sense of their personality and motivations. Some are there out of loyalty to Wheel or Kraft, one seems to want to prove how tough he is, one's big and dumb and seems like he might not really understand the consequences of what he's doing. One's a former member of Phantom's team and wants revenge, and one just seems to be a sadist. While I'd love to learn more about each, I am satisfied with what's there. Conversely, who I really don't like are the humans in the Area Zero that you have to protect. Sure, Neige is cool. She's a journalist who seems to be the main driving force behind this anti-Wheel movement and has strong convictions that she's willing to fight for. Her compatriots are just kind of a bunch of worthless, racist pricks who can't do anything by themselves. At one point, you need to rescue them one by one, and as you do so, they straight up insult you and seem to blame you. This is especially weird given that the main theme of the game seems to be coexistence. I like the idea overall because it struck me as an evolution of Iris' dream from X4. She wanted a world for just Reploids where they could live in peace, and this expands that idea to include everyone. It just feels a little discouraging when the people you're trying to protect shit on you for being a Reploid, as you, ironically, tried to save them from a human. Maybe some of them do change by the end, but it really seems like most of the heavy lifting for this dream is going to come down to CL and Neige. Oh, and that one small child who's too innocent to be a jerk. Now for big spoilers. So, you've been warned. Kraft sucks. He really sucks. Not only as a boss fight, but as a person. I get that he's afraid of Wheel, and he thinks that the best way to make sure that the most people survive are by obeying him. I get that he's in love with Neige, which is cute, and that part of his deal is for her safety. And while I do hate how this is, rather than working with her, he actively goes against her wishes because he thinks that's the only way to save her, but yeah, I get it. He's the archetype of the physically strong character that's mentally weak, whereas Neige is the opposite, a simple human that will stand up to certain death for her ideals. It's complex, it's nuanced, it's good. When he takes that weakness and swings it in the other direction though, hijacking Ragnarok and shooting Wheel with it, taking out a lot of Neo Arcadia's population with him, it gets kind of indefensible. From a pragmatic point of view, the world's population has already been knocked down a lot, making this loss even more tragic. He also has to know that Neige would never approve of this, so once again, he's just trampling over her feelings and putting full stock in his own plans, even after being convinced he was wrong. And again, he's just doing it out of fear. He thinks that's the only way Wheel can be killed and the only way to protect Neige. Sure, he can try and justify it all he wants, saying that the humans living in Neo Arcadia are guilty by going along with Wheel and the ones that create the wars that they force the Reploids to fight for them, but I'm sure many of them are doing so out of fear of Wheel, much like him, so in addition to being a coward, he is also a hypocrite. I don't know, maybe I'm being too harsh, but I just hate Kraft. And why the hell do I have to fight him again after he fires Ragnarok? Didn't he accomplish his goal by then? Was he worried that he failed? Was it so he could continue to impose his will? Or did he just want to be punished? It was just one last time for him to go against Neige's wishes, getting himself killed and leaving her alone. Asshole. Back to that attack on Neo Arcadia and the coexistence theme though, I imagine many humans did come around to the idea of living together with Reploids after the Resistance rescued them from the wreckage of that city. Maybe some of them came to that conclusion out of gratitude, maybe some from necessity, but I guess even forced peace is still peace. Reploids are pretty integrated into society in the following ZX games, so I imagine CL comes through and it does make what Zero fought for seem a lot less pointless. As for Wheel, he's still an evil bastard, like I discussed last time. Eliminating people's options to force them to submit to him is certainly diabolical, and him and his troops largely don't even hide how cartoonishly evil they're being, since it seems a sure thing that they can get away with it. Making his last action a spiteful attempt to wipe out the last inhabitable piece of land is just the cherry on top of the despicable sundae. He's a true villain, not a silly and somewhat harmless one like Wily, and not an inevitable recurring annoyance like Sigma. I hate Wheel as a person, but love him as a bad guy. Him being immortal is kind of a weird twist, though. I guess it shows what a perversion of humanity he is, and it might hint at the improvements they make to the human body in the ZX line that gives them a lifespan more in line with Reploids, but I kinda have to question the why. Given the way he kinda poses it as a never-ending hell, I first interpreted it as a punishment, not allowing him to die, and thought it was the stupidest thing in the series, since that meant that everything bad from 03 onward was the fault of a misguided punishment from some likely edgelord judge. And to be fair, Edgy is kind of the Zero series bag, but actually reviewing it this time, I noticed he didn't explicitly say why they did this to him. Was it some kind of punishment? Did they need his knowledge badly enough during the Elf Wars that they did to keep him alive? I don't know, but I kinda need to understand how stupid this is. As for the ending itself, I kinda like it. I'm of the belief that Zero was kinda looking for a place to die for much of the Zero game, so having him face off against the main villain, both dying in the process, wraps things up nicely. The whole series kinda builds towards this. You take out Copy X, the symbol of Reploid oppression and discrimination, and Harpuya's less harsh rule gives an opening for coexistence. Ellipso destroys X's body, getting rid of a relic and reminder from times of war. Wheel tries to revive much of this past by awakening Omega and reviving Copy X, but destroying them, along with the original X in his cyber body stepping aside, further cleared the way for the future. With the destruction of Neo Acadia and the return of nature in Area Zero, the only thing standing in the way of a new start for humanity and Reploids together were Zero and Wheel, making this the perfect ending. It marks a new beginning for CL too, since, while this is slightly cruel to say, she can no longer rely on Zero. She's a strong character and accomplishes a lot, perhaps more than anyone else in the series, and yet as soon as she revives Zero, she seems to depend on him entirely. Maybe if the Resistance was more dependable, this wouldn't be the case, but the most productive she seems to be is between 1 and 2, when Zero is absent and the Resistance is forced to stand on its own. With Zero's exit, and members like Servu and Kolbar seeming to be pulling more of their weight, I think she'll finally be able to achieve her full potential. All of this is slightly diminished by us never seeing her again, only hearing stories, and them immediately bringing back Zero, X, and a few others as biometals in the next game, but at least we have Alouette. So, now that I played the whole series, what do I think? All are kinda rough around the edges, especially when it comes to difficulty curves and balancing, and they can be very frustrating. Of the 4, I'd say 3 is easily the best, being the most doable in terms of difficulty and giving you a lot of options to customize your loadout. It also has my favorite boss designs and story, and in some ways almost feels like it could have been the ending for the series, though 4 does wrap it up nicer. If you play the Zero ZX collection, there are some changes to help buffer the difficulty, like extra checkpoints. I wanted the full experience though, so I didn't use these, but they might balance out some of my complaints, if you want to give it a try. Even with that though, the game will likely still be pretty tricky, so if you're not a platformer enthusiast, it might seem overwhelming. If you are feeling funky and fresh though, I'd recommend playing it, specifically on this collection to give yourself options. For me personally, I was surprised by my run through the games. They were a lot rougher and felt a lot less fair than I remember. It might come down to me having more free time and thus more patience during my original playthrough. I did seem to get more out of the story though. I think typing up scripts for these videos helped in that regard a great deal, me finding several things kinda dumb at the time, then when it came time to talk about them, putting them down in text and really thinking things over, I came up with reasons and explanations in the process. I might try doing occasional runs of these games to see if getting better at them will help me to enjoy them more. But for now, I'm done, though I'll be playing through the ZX games sometime in the coming weeks. And that's that. I was gonna talk about Ultra Despair Girls, and I should have the game finished by the time this goes up. This episode was already about my normal length though, so we'll tackle that next time for sure. Arceus also comes out at the end of the week, so I should have my first impressions. I might even stream it over on the Victory Tricksters if you want to witness it firsthand. For now though, thanks for watching, maybe subscribe if you enjoyed this sort of thing, and perhaps I'll see you in the next episode.